But what I'd like to do today, really, in this time that we've got together, is try and really convey three key ideas. So firstly, I want to convey the fact that the history of ideas matters. So within the social sciences, where ideas come from, the context within which they were thought up, and how they've evolved through time is really matters. It was really important. So I think quite often social scientists can seem a little bit pedantic about the genealogy of particular ideas, but there is a reason why that is, and I'd like to convey some of the importance behind that. The second thing, and so, I would like to convey that it's important. You don't need to know the whole history of every new theory or concept that you engage in, but it's important to know that there is a history, and to listen out for that history, and to be able to recognize or identify any problematic narratives, and listen to your collaborators, to people that you work with who will know more about these ideas. And the history of ideas matters for two key reasons. Firstly, ideas represent knowledge, and knowledge accumulates. So if we don't understand where our ideas came from and the context within which they developed, we may miss out some critically important dimensions. And there may be dimensions that we don't agree with. So we may be feeding into and perpetuating a narrative and an ideology that actually it is not intentional. Related to that, ideas, and hence knowledge, is power. So if we perpetuate these problematic ideas, or if we only draw on certain sources of ideas, so we perpetuate unequal knowledge, we're going to perpetuate the problematic power imbalances that exist. And so the history of ideas matters, and part of that is because there's power in these ideas. And so the next thing I'd like to convey is that power is really important within the social sciences and the humanities. Whether or not you explicitly study power and engage in ideas of power, you are always thinking about it, and you are always aware of it, and you are always reflecting on it. Power is a huge concept, and it's tackled probably by every discipline within the social sciences. So it's, I'm not saying you need to understand power in all its entirety, but I think you need to be aware that it is a critical concept. And then finally, scale matters. And so this is coming back to the ideas around political ecology, particularly power and scale. And so we'll come back to that later. Well, some of what I say may be stating the obvious to some of you, but I think it is, quite useful sometimes to go back to the basics and the foundation. So, what is social science research? So I guess in its simplest form, it's about researching people, it's about researching society, and it's about researching how they interact with one another. Most of us, or all of us, I think, work in an environmental context. So when we're social science research in an environmental context, it's important to think of people in places. So thinking about how people impact their environments, how environments impact people, and also trying to understand those subjective relationships that people have with their environments. So elements, how their environments shape their identities, their sense of place, how they relate and affect their communities. And there's a range of different social science research methods. So, you've got some of the more traditional approaches to do with archival research, or to do with interviews and in-person interviews and focus groups. In the sort of 60s and 70s, there was a real revolution and growth in GIS and remote sensing technologies that are used by many social scientists. And more recently, there's a whole suite, I think, of more creative and innovative social science research methods that are emerging, including video ethnography. The photograph in the middle of the Lego is there are approaches to using Lego in your research to help to understand and explore how people's identities are expressed and how their relationships work out. And the last picture on the bottom right-hand side is just giving you an indication of what's often thought of as participatory action research. So I guess this is just to demonstrate that there's a range of different methods, old and new. Some methods are observing, and some methods are interacting, and some methods are actually creating new knowledge. There are a few key concepts and ideas within social science research, which I find is really important for me to constantly think about and to ground myself in. And one of them is this idea of reflexivity. And reflexivity is thought of as the partial, provisional, and the perspectival nature of knowledge. So it's recognizing that knowledge is never complete. As we do research, we do research in order to change things, in order to understand things, or in order to change the way things are. But it's also important to realize that as we do that research can also change us. So I think one of the ideas I heard earlier, I can't remember who it was, talked about going to Kenya. Now, in fact, I think almost all of your ideas, when you're talking about what drew you to what you're doing, there was a process. And that process may have started when you were younger, may have reflected your underlying beliefs and political orientations, but they also could have reflected the research process that you had gone through. So as in doing research, you discovered what you didn't know, or you weren't able to do, or how impartial the methods and the knowledge that you had at your disposal were. So I guess we always, as in everything that we do, in all of the research that we collect, we're constantly learning and we're constantly changing. And so within social sciences, there's a real emphasis on engaging with that and embracing that. There is a limit to how reflexive we can be. So even though, as we conduct our research, we reflect on how knowledge is only partial and it only gives us a small piece of the puzzle. We reflect on what assumptions may be built into the theories and methods, and we reflect on the limitations of what we have at our hands. And we try and account for that, or take that into consideration as we learn and as we do research. Another way of expressing that is we are aware that our research is not objective. So we bring our biases to our research. There are biases inherent in our research, in our methods. And so we try and understand those biases and reflect on them. But even though we know we're objective, even though we know we cannot be objective, and we try and account for them, we know we can't know all of our biases. So we can't account for all of it. So part of that reflexivity is understanding what's missing, but understanding that even as good a job as we do of reflecting on that, we're never going to capture everything. The reason I put this photo up on this slide is, again, it takes me back to Kenya. So I went to school in Kenya, and back in the 80s, I was at school in Nairobi, and the president at the time, Daniel Moi, hosted this great big ivory burn. In Kenya, hunting wildlife has always, for a long time, been illegal, and a key value underpinning conservation in Eastern Africa is the fact that nobody's allowed to hunt, and it's morally unethical to kill wildlife. And that's in stark contrast to policies in Southern Africa, where hunting is actually part of conservation, and it's used to fund conservation. And there's a very there's quite a fierce debate in the literature as to which position is right or wrong, and I'm not taking any position on that. But going to this ivory burning event when I was like in my early teens, really shaped my sense of what conservation means in the Kenyan context. So when I think about terrestrial conservation, I strongly believe that hunting is morally wrong. But I'm aware that that's shaped by the experiences that I had growing up. And I find it very interesting because when I come to my research that's within fisheries, I don't carry those same values across. So within fisheries, my work is very much about keeping people fishing. And I believe that the best way to sustainable fisheries and conserving our marine ecosystems is through peopled seas and lived in landscapes. So as I do my research, I constantly reflect on how my experiences and how my past and how my upbringing has shaped the way I interpret the data that I collect and the way I approach my questions. Because we can't be completely objective, because our reflexivity can't extend to the point where we remove all of those biases, we have to reflect on elements of who we are and how who we are affects our reasoning. And so this picture is me as I think a 2-year-old, and I guess this is trying to convey my positionality. And as I've become more interdisciplinary and I've worked with people in different disciplines, I've come to realize how my experiences as a child growing up in East Africa with a black mother and a white father has shaped how I see the world. How it shapes how I approach questions, how for me issues of justice and equity are central to the research that I'm doing, whether or not they are part of the research questions, so that they're always in the backdrop of what I ask. One of the things that social scientists really emphasize is this need to reflect on your positionality in order to be reflexive, and to front load what you do with that positionality. And that often runs counter to some natural scientific methodologies the way they try and address objectivity is by trying to remove themselves from that position. So that I see them as two different ways of dealing with the same issue. So you either front end your biases and embrace them, or you try as much as possible to remove your biases. But even if you do that approach, it's important to recognize you can't completely remove them. And part of this is also recognizing that the way the world is to you, so when you do your research and you collect your data, it's not that way to everyone else. So somebody else approaching the exact same question could legitimately come to a different answer. And the way it is now is not necessarily the way it used to be. And I think importantly, it's not the way it always has to be. So we have the opportunity to change things through our research and through what we do. So this slide scares me a little bit. I mean, I think, within theory is such a big word, and I think particularly within the social sciences, theory is really central to everything that you do. So social sciences is often concerned with understanding or addressing problems. And for this reason, and because of the way knowledge accumulates, it's important to build on theory or to advance theory or to develop theory in doing that, because theory is what connects what we as individuals find. So whether you're researching an individual or a community or a network, but it connects that to the broader processes of knowledge production. So theory is what makes sure our science or our research, our knowledge, doesn't sit alone and is relevant, I guess. But I don't know. I know when the term social theory kind of scares me or terrifies me or bores me, perhaps. And I think part of that is because maybe when I think of social theory, I would, at least when I was at university, I would think of old dead white people. And so I didn't really, I guess my positionality, I didn't really connect to that. They were all often long dead. They often had questionable ideas that still shape society and the way we approach things. And it was often the same names that represent the canon. So it's very important names, Marx, Rousseau, Kant, and Hume. So I guess this notion of social theory disconnected me from really engaging with social theory, particularly earlier on in my career. But of course, there were broader voices contributing to philosophical thought and development, and we know that, and increasingly now we know that there are lots of diverse voices talking, and diverse voices, so that kind of, the canon still exists, but I think in the US, definitely here in the UK and everywhere, who we're talking about, who we're thinking about, and whose knowledge we're building on is a lot broader than it ever has been, I'd say. So I guess when we think of theory, I think of it in two ways. So you can think of theory with a big T. So think of theory as the sort of macro theory. So this is things like Marxism or feminism or post-colonialisms. And these are really quite abstract ideas. They're representations of philosophy or social theory, but they reflect kind of your identity or your political beliefs. And they're intimately combined with your positionality. I think, Mel, this is what you were getting at just now. And if you look at these pictures, I guess, that I've chosen to represent these three types of theory I've got up here, it's no surprise that they are, they represent struggles, because often these big theories emerge in resistance. But you may already be aware of what your kind of, political orientations are and your beliefs are, and they may shape, how you approach your work, but they may not. And when you read a piece of social theory, a piece of social research in particular, it may not identify itself as post-colonial or feminist or Marx, but that it will be. The writing will be informed by a sort of particular philosophical underpinning. So it's important to try and look for that. And you probably will sense it or you'll detect it, but just getting tuned in a little bit to that. And the reason why these kind of big or macro theories are important is because they relate to methodology. So they relate to how we approach the work that we do, what we think of as data, what we think of as valuable data, and how we go about collecting that data. And they change how we think and how we understand. They change through times, often in reaction to events. So in the sort of, early on last century, the advent of innovative ways of collecting large-scale quantitative data by environmental scientists. So those, big data was beginning to emerge, not like big data we talk about nowadays, but remote sensing and GIS and census data. And within the social sciences, there was this real sort of, quantitative turn, particularly within geography. But this kind of, real dominance of quantitative approaches then created the conditions for a little bit of a, I guess, reaction towards that data. And this was driven in the 70s and the 80s. And a lot of this was often driven by feminist geographers who were trying to argue or trying to point out the need to actually engage with people. So these quantitative data sets and large numbers were useful and valuable for telling us something, but there was a lot that it didn't tell us. And so this really paved the way for the qualitative revolution, particularly within geography. So I guess just when we're thinking of big T theory, it's important to reflect on what your personal politics or beliefs are. It's natural that your research, what you are drawn to or what you gravitate towards, will reflect your personal or your political approach. And it's important, and that that picks up on your positionality as well. And also it's important, again, I think, just reiterate, to be aware that much of social science is underpinned by some ideology. So even if we can't, even if it's not stated, it's important to recognise that it is there, and look for it. But moving on, I guess, to at more of a tangible level, perhaps you can call these theories with a small t, are the theories that we apply in our research. And you can think of these as a supposition or as a system of ideas that are intended to explain something. So particularly based on general principles that are independent of the thing to be studied. So theories, in this sense, help us understand or explain how the world works, helps us to explain problems within the context of how we've created them. So rather than just understanding or looking at their relationships that exist between A and B, we understand why those relationships exist or have emerged. It allows us alternatives. It allows us to imagine other ways of those relationships existing. So does not just assume, one way of being. So, for example, Marxist theory emerged as an alternative or exists as an alternative. And theories need to be understood in the context within which they kind of emerged, the content of the theories, what they tell us about. And theories are often really useful for critiquing ideas. I think a lot of social science theory, this is perhaps where it's most distinct from more kind of natural science or scientific science theories, is it's also about saying what's wrong with the understandings that we have. And in doing that, kind of reimagining alternate ways of being, fairer ways of being. And so this is where you have a lot of the kind of resistance. So it often theories or ideas emerge because we have created these unjust systems, and it's offering us that alternative. And I think one of the important things also is that social theory is central to social science research. Social data without theory isn't really social science. So that goes back to, and so I'm not suggesting that I'm not saying you need to build theory or even progress theory. I think social scientists are, that is what they're concerned with doing. They're building theory, they're challenging theory, they're deconstructing theory, they're advancing theory. But I think it's important when you use social science data that you have an understanding of why you're collecting the data that you're collecting, what the theory is that underpins the questions that you're asking and the way you're asking your questions. Sarah Breslow, the Twitter handle that you can see at the top, has started this Twitter thread, which is Environmental Social Science 101. And she's a wonderful person. She's an environmental anthropologist, and she works on conservation issues and wellbeing issues. And it's a great thread, so do follow her and do have a look at that Twitter handle if you just want to pick up some of the things that she's tweeting about. I guess then moving on from theory. So I guess when I was talking about theory is important and ideas are important, and within the social sciences, often people get very particular about words and what you use and words that you use. And that's because words matter. They convey ideas through language. And language is knowledge, and knowledge is power. And so, you know, there are different ways of understanding and thinking about power within the social sciences. And I, you know, definitely don't agree with necessarily all theories of power. I definitely don't understand all of them. But Foucault's one of, you know, a particularly, I guess, well-known thinker on power, and he's particularly well known for his ideas around the fact that power is relational. So it's about how people relate to one another. It's about, and it's constantly moving and shifting and evolving. So it's contextual, and it's relational, and it's shifting. And in this way, and this is how language and words and ideas can really affect, can really come to be dominant and can really affect outcomes. Because what's said or what's measured becomes what is. And whether that is the only way of knowing or being, or whether that is the fairest, or even whether that's the best, you know, or even if it's correct, it actually puts it into it makes it reality. I've just put there 3 examples, so income and calories and development, and I think these are just 3 examples of how ideas and then terms, concepts have effectively failed us. And one of the things is that once an idea, I think there's, yeah, a bad idea is a lot harder to get rid of than a good idea is to come up with. I can't remember whose quote that is, but I think we see this very much in a lot of these kind of entrenched ideas that shape environmental and development discourse. And despite being shown over and over again to be flawed or to be problematic, and you see them persisting and you see them coming back again. Part of the reason why they persist and they keep coming back, I think, is people don't understand the roots of those ideas. And part of it is people don't question that as well. And also simplistic narratives, I think, are quite easy for people to adopt and engage. So I'll just talk a little bit about income and calories, I guess, because again, they personally relate to me, and then I think the calories one relates through the work that I do. So back to Kenya, and I think there's been a debate, you know, there's been a constant debate for 50 years around what poverty is. And, you know, you've got a large number of excellent scholars who very clearly demonstrated that poverty is not about income, including, you know, Nobel Prize winners like Amartya Sen. It's about marginalization, it's about capabilities. But still, the notion that income is the route out of poverty persists, even when income can exacerbate poverty and is shown to exacerbate poverty. So again, I've taken you back here to Kenya and to the gates of the Masai Mara, a place again that I'm very fond of. And the Ma are the Maasai people. If you look at, you know, even just statistics on Kenya, the Ma across all of the over 50 different ethnic groups in Kenya, the Ma have the lowest levels of educational attainment, the lowest levels of educational attendance, the lowest and the highest indicators of underdevelopment and poverty in the Kenya. And this is despite them being the ones who live adjacent to the greatest economic draw almost to the country. And a large part of this is because of the transition that the Ma community have been forced to undergo towards a cash-based economy. And so it is the very transition towards an income-based economy. So then their measures of income will have increased, but their measures of well-being and their measures of poverty will have increased. And there have been large numbers of debates about, you know, whether I think, we can track income through time, and we can see that income has increased through time, but that's largely a result of us commodifying more and more resources. So because more things are commodified, we measure, more things are turned into income, it looks as if income is increasing and we're getting rid of poverty, but whether that actually represents an improvement in people's well-being and their subjective quality of life is debatable, to say the least. The other, I guess, similar example of where terms have been applied or associated with concepts and are then very difficult to get rid of. And so this is in the case of food. So go back to the 1950s to 1960s, and efforts to address food insecurity always focused on increasing calories. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was first realized that calories were not the only form of food insecurity, and nutrition was really important. And it was, I think it was the 70s that Amartya Sen wrote about the fact that availability of food was not actually what resulted in people being able to actually have access to that food. So we've known for over 50 years that access to food and the ability to use that food is not linked to calories, but still the vast majority of our efforts to address food insecurity focuses on increasing calories, the supply of calories, often through the provision of cereals, often supplemented with high sugar intake. And the graph you can see on the right-hand side is just from a paper from Ty Beale from 2017, and that just shows you how the density, so the nutritional density of the available food has changed from the 1960s through to 2011. And the red places are where the available foods that are available on the market have a low density. So red is bad, orange is bad, and yellow is good. And so despite 50 years of effort into addressing food insecurity, we see very little progress, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa. And this is, again, because this connection between food and calories is so entrenched in our ideologies. And it's so entrenched that it's, in fact, exacerbating the nutritional situation.